Welcome to Mystery Manor Tales. I'm your host, Evelyn Whitaker. Settle in with a cup of tea, dear listeners, as we embark on a journey into the world of intrigue and deduction. Tonight, we present a brand new original tale in the style of the incomparable Agatha Christie, Hercule Poirot and the Desperate Culprit. This is a long, relaxing mystery perfect for unwinding, clocking in at over 90 minutes if read at a leisurely pace. We'll dive into a locked-room puzzle set in a foggy 1920s English country estate, with our beloved Belgian detective, Hercule Poirot, unravelling the threads. Chapter 1, The Invitation. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late October, written in a bold, impatient hand on heavy cream paper, watermarked with the crest of Blackthorn Manor. Hercule Poirot turned the envelope once, twice, admiring the precision of the wax seal, a stag rampant, before slipping his silver letter opener beneath the flap. The note was brief, almost brusque. My dear Monsieur Poirot, you will have heard, no doubt, that I do not suffer fools. I have, however, a great admiration for genius. Come to Blackthorn this Friday. The express from Victoria reaches Lewes at 4:30. My motor will meet you. Bring no valet, my staff are sufficient, and no curiosity about my affairs. I desire only the pleasure of your company and perhaps the loan of those famous little grey cells should conversation flag. Yours, Reginald Hargrove Poirot, permitted himself the smallest of smiles. Men of Sir Reginald's stamp rarely invited him for idle pleasure. They invited him because they sensed a storm coming and wished the most celebrated detective in Europe to be on hand when the lightning struck. He folded the letter, placed it in the breast pocket of his perfectly cut overcoat, and gazed out upon the orderly squares of London. Already the plane trees along the embankment were shedding their last yellow leaves into the Thames. A cold, wet wind was rising. Poirot disliked the English countryside intensely. He found it untidy, damp, and inclined to mud. But curiosity, that most insatiable of mistresses, had already accepted on his behalf. 3 days later, on a Friday soaked through with drizzle, the Bentley that collected him from Lewes Station purred along narrow lanes flanked by dripping yew hedges. The chauffeur, a silent, broad-shouldered man, drove as though the car itself resented the journey. They climbed steadily into the South Downs until, quite suddenly, the hedges fell away and Blackthorn Manor revealed itself. It was not beautiful. It was magnificent in the way a fortress is magnificent, severe, grey and watchful. 3 stories of Sussex stone rose above a sweep of gravel. Ranks of chimneys stood like sentries against a sky the colour of wet slate. Ivy clung to the walls with desperate fingers, and every window seemed to stare down at the arriving car with the cold appraisal of a judge. The front doors, black oak studded with iron, opened before the Bentley had fully stopped. A butler of funereal dignity bowed. Monsieur Poirot, Sir Reginald is expecting you. Poirot stepped into a vaulted hall where suits of armour kept company with the mounted heads of long-dead stags. A fire roared in a grate large enough to roast an ox, yet the air remained chill. Somewhere in the distance a clock struck 5 with the solemnity of a passing bell. Sir Reginald Hargrove appeared at the top of the great staircase as though he had been waiting for precisely that chime. He was tall, lean, and hard as flint, dressed in Lovat tweed that looked slept in only by lesser men. His moustache was iron grey, his eyes the pale, piercing blue of a winter sea. "Monsieur Poirot," he called down, voice echoing. "Welcome to my little corner of England. Come up, brandy awaits, and I abhor drinking alone." Poirot ascended the sweeping stair, noting the family portraits that lined the walls. Hargroves in armour, Hargroves in periwigs, Hargroves in the scarlet of 19th-century generals. All shared the same hawkish nose and unforgiving stare. In the long gallery that served as drawing room, the other guests had already gathered around a blazing fire. Poirot's quick, appraising glance took them in as neatly as a card-sharp counts a deck. Lady Amelia Hargrove stood by the mantel, a slender woman of 45 whose beauty had ripened rather than faded. Her gown of deep claret silk shimmered when she moved, and the famous triple string of pearls at her throat caught the firelight like drops of frozen moonlight. She greeted Poirot with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Her son, Captain Victor Hargrove, late of the Guards, currently of nowhere in particular, lounged against a window, a cigarette burning forgotten between his fingers. At 28, he was handsome in the careless way of men who have never been denied anything except responsibility. Beside him, leaning lightly on the back of his chair, was his sister, Eleanor. 25, dark-haired and vivid, she possessed her mother's elegance, but none of her restraint. Her eyes, green as wet leaves, flashed with intelligence and something close to defiance. Mr. Desmond Blackwell, Sir Reginald's business partner, stood a little apart, a glass of whisky already in hand. He was thick-set, florid, and dressed with the expensive ostentation of a man who had made money too quickly to acquire taste. His smile was wide, but it never touched the small, calculating eyes. Dr. Julian Forbes, the family physician, completed the party for the moment. Tall, stooping, and gentle-mannered, he seemed perpetually on the verge of apology. His suit was several years out of fashion, the cuffs faintly frayed. Finally, almost invisible until she moved, stood Miss Clara Thorne, the upper housemaid who had been promoted to lady's maid when Lady Amelia dismissed the last one for impertinence. Clara was 32, neat as a pin, with soft brown hair and watchful eyes, the colour of rain on stone. She curtsied to Poirot with perfect deference and melted back into the shadows. Sir Reginald clapped his hands once, the sound shockingly loud. "Now that the guest of honour has arrived, let us dine. I have a Bordeaux laid down since before the war that refuses to be ignored any longer." They processed into the baronial dining hall, where candles flickered in silver sconces, and a table long enough for 20 waited with places set for 8. The meal was magnificent. Clear turtle soup, sole in white wine, saddle of mutton with red currant jelly, and a charlotte russe that made Poirot close his eyes in reverence. Conversation, however, was less harmonious. Victor drank too much claret and spoke loudly of Ascot and the impossibility of living on a younger son's portion. Eleanor countered with cool, cutting wit that made her brother flush. Lady Amelia's smile grew tighter with every exchange. Blackwell attempted several times to steer talk towards steel prices and the coming boom. Sir Reginald silenced him with a look. Only Dr. Forbes remained gently neutral, murmuring agreement wherever it was least likely to give offence. At length, Sir Reginald pushed back his chair. "Coffee and brandy in the library. I have something to say that will not wait until morning." The library was a long, sombre room, lined with thousands of leather-bound volumes that smelled of neglect and candle smoke. A fire had been laid but not lit. The air felt heavy, almost expectant. Sir Reginald did not sit. He stood with his back to the cold hearth and surveyed them all as though they were shareholders at a stormy board meeting. "I am altering my will," he announced without preamble. "On Monday, my solicitor arrives to witness the new document. Victor will receive an annuity, sufficient for a gentleman, insufficient for a wastrel. Eleanor will keep the portion I originally settled on her, provided she marries with my approval before she is 30. Amelia, his gaze flicked to his wife, will have the London house and an income, but Blackthorn and the bulk of the estate will pass to a trust. I have tired of family sentiment. The silence that followed was absolute. Victor laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You can't be serious, father." "I have never been more serious in my life." Lady Amelia's hand crept to her pearls. "Reginald, this is neither the time nor—" "It is precisely the time." He turned to Poirot, almost apologetically. "You see, Monsieur Poirot, even in the best regulated families there is friction. I thought your presence might discourage hysterics." Poirot inclined his head. "I am desolated, Sir Reginald, to find myself a witness to domestic unhappiness. Yet I perceive that the matter is decided." Blackwell cleared his throat. "Speaking as your partner, Reginald, might I suggest—" "You may not." The words cracked like a whip. Eleanor rose, white to the lips. "If you will, excuse me. I find I have a headache." Victor drained his glass and followed her without a word. Lady Amelia remained seated, very still, her fingers twisting the pearls until the thread threatened to snap. Dr. Forbes looked as though he wished to sink through the Turkey carpet. Clara, who had been serving coffee, slipped silently from the room. Sir Reginald watched them go, then turned to Poirot with something close to satisfaction. "There, the cards are on the table. Now perhaps we may all sleep soundly." Poirot murmured something polite. "Sleep soundly? No, mon ami. In a house where love has turned to acid and greed wears evening dress, no one would sleep soundly tonight." Outside, the wind rose, rattling the tall library windows like impatient fingers demanding entry. Somewhere in the labyrinth of corridors, a clock chimed 11. Poirot retired to the blue suite, a sombre apartment hung with tapestries of unicorn hunts. His valet George had been given a room in the servants' wing, Sir Reginald's orders, and so Poirot performed his own meticulous nighttime ritual. The folding of clothes, the arranging of toilet articles in perfect alignment, the twirling of the famous moustaches before the looking-glass. Only when the house was hushed did he permit himself a small sigh. "Tomorrow," he told his reflection, "Hercule Poirot will observe, and the day after, who knows, the English aristocracy is capable of anything when inheritance is at stake." He extinguished the light. In the darkness of Blackthorn Manor, someone else was also awake, someone whose desperation had already sharpened itself into a bright, lethal point. The storm that had been gathering for years was about to break. Chapter 2. The Cry in the Dark. The house slept uneasily. Rain hissed against the leads. Wind prowled the chimneys like a restless animal. And the old timbers of Blackthorn Manor creaked and muttered to themselves long after the last lamp was turned down. At 23 minutes past 2, a single terrible cry shattered the hush. It was a man's voice, raw with shock and pain, rising to a strangled gasp before it was cut off as sharply as if a hand had been clamped across the mouth that uttered it. For one heartbeat, the entire house seemed to hold its breath. Then chaos erupted. Doors flew open along the east corridor. Bare feet slapped on polished oak. Victor Hargrove appeared first, shirt half-buttoned, hair wild, a heavy poker gripped in one fist. Eleanor was only a pace behind, wrapped in a green silk dressing-gown, her face blanched to ivory. Lady Amelia followed, clutching at the newel post for support, pearls gleaming against the pale column of her throat. From the west wing came Dr. Forbes, spectacles askew, and Blackwell lumbering behind him in a purple dressing-gown that made him look like an overripe plum. Servants spilled from the back stairs. The butler, 2 footmen, Clara Thorne with her hair in a long plait down her back and terror in her eyes. The cry had come from the ground floor, from Sir Reginald's study. Victor reached the door first. He seized the handle and rattled it violently. Locked! "Father!" he shouted, hammering with the poker. "Father, open this door!" No answer, only the steady drumming of rain and the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Eleanor pressed both hands to her mouth. He screamed! He screamed as though— She could not finish. Dr. Forbes pushed forward, calm even in extremity. "Stand back, Captain." Together he and Victor put their shoulders to the oak. The lock was old and stout, but the third heave splintered the jamb, and the door burst inward. They stumbled into darkness thick with the smell of cigar smoke, brandy, and something else, something metallic and warm. Blackwell found the light switch. The chandelier flared, revealing a scene that froze every heart. Sir Reginald Hargrove lay face down across his desk, arms flung wide as though embracing the scattered papers beneath him. The hilt of an antique Malay kris protruded from between his shoulder blades. The blade had been driven in to the hilt. Blood had poured down the back of his brocade smoking jacket, pooling on the leather inset of the desk, and dripping with slow, deliberate plops onto the Persian rug. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Lady Amelia gave a low, animal moan and slid to the floor in a rustle of silk and pearls. Victor dropped the poker with a clang. "Good God!" he whispered. "Good God!" Dr. Forbes crossed the room in 3 strides, pressed 2 fingers to the side of Sir Reginald's neck, and shook his head. The gesture was small, final, and utterly irrevocable. Eleanor turned away, pressing her face into Clara's shoulder. The maid held her automatically, though her own eyes were fixed in horror on her master's body. Poirot had arrived unnoticed in the doorway. He stood very still, taking in every detail with the precision of a surgeon. The study windows were closed and latched from within. Rain streaked the panes, but no mud or wet prints marred the sills. The only door, the one now hanging drunkenly from its broken lock, had been bolted on the inside. The iron bolt still hung in its hasp, the key glinting in the lock on the inner side. A coal fire burned low in the grate, yet the room felt colder than the corridor. On the desk beside the body stood a crystal tumbler, half full of brandy, and a cut-glass decanter. Papers lay everywhere. Share certificates, a draft of the new will, a single sheet with the heading "To my heirs" in Sir Reginald's impatient scrawl. Poirot stepped carefully around the pooling blood. He touched nothing, yet his gaze missed nothing. The angle of the dagger, the position of the dead man's hands, the faint smear on the brass handle of the safe set into the bookshelves. Inspector Hawkins arrived 20 minutes later, driven hard from Lewis by a sergeant who looked as though he had seen a ghost. The local constable, a gangling youth, stood guard outside the broken door with the air of a man wishing himself anywhere else. Hawkins was a large square man with a moustache like a yard brush and the stolid calm of long experience. He surveyed the room, the body, the stunned faces, and gave a grunt that might have meant anything. "Locked from the inside, bolted, key on the inside, windows fastened," he recited as though reading from an invisible charge sheet. "No sign of forced entry anywhere else. Looks like the impossible, Mr. Poirot." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Precisely, Inspector. It looks. That is the fascination." He turned to the silent gathering in the doorway. "Who discovered that the door was locked?" Eleanor found her voice first, thin and trembling. "I did. I couldn't sleep. I came down for a book and heard the cry, then nothing. I rattled the handle, called out. When no one answered, I raised the alarm. And the time? Almost 2:30. The clock in the hall was striking the half hour as I reached the stairs." Victor lit a cigarette with shaking fingers. "I heard the cry too. Thought at first it was a fox or something outside. Then Eleanor screamed. Lady Amelia, revived with sal volatile and supported by Clara, whispered, 'My husband was alive at midnight. He came to my room, angry, about the will. He left saying he had papers to destroy.' Blackwell cleared his throat. I was awake, reading, heard nothing until the commotion." Dr. Forbes added quietly, "I gave Sir Reginald a sleeping draught at 11. He refused it, said he had too much on his mind." Clara, voice barely audible, murmured, "I banked the fires and locked up at 12. Sir Reginald was still in here. He told me not to disturb him again tonight." Poirot listened, head cocked like a bird. Then he spoke, softly but with absolute authority. "No one is to leave the house. Inspector Hawkins will wish to speak to each of you. For myself, I accept the commission you did not quite offer me, Sir Reginald." He glanced at the body with something close to pity. "Hercule Poirot will discover who entered this room that could not be entered, and who left it that could not be left." Outside, the rain redoubled, drumming on the roof like impatient fingers. Inside the study, the blood continued its slow drip onto the rug, marking time until the truth should be known. Chapter 3. The First Threads. Dawn crept over Blackthorn Manor pale and reluctant, the colour of watered milk. The study door now stood propped shut with a chair while 2 constables kept watch, and the house itself seemed to have drawn a long, shuddering breath and decided not to exhale. Hercule Poirot took his breakfast alone in the small morning room. He consumed 1 perfectly poached egg, 2 slices of thin toast, and a single cup of chocolate so thick it coated the spoon. When the tray was removed, he dabbed his moustache, drew on pale grey kid gloves, although he was indoors, and announced to the butler that he was ready. He began with the room itself. The study smelled of death and wet ash. Dr. Forbes had removed the body an hour earlier. The outline of Sir Reginald remained in darker stains upon the desk. Poirot circled it slowly, his patent leather shoes making no sound on the rug. He examined the kris, a wavy-bladed Malay dagger taken years ago from a display above the mantelpiece. Noted the angle of entry, downward, from behind, delivered by a right-handed person taller than the victim, and observed that the blade had been wiped clean on the velvet chairback before being returned to the wound. He tested the windows. Each latch was old but firm, the paint undisturbed. Outside, the flower bed beneath showed only the neat indentations of the gardener's boots from the previous morning. The door told the same tale. The bolt was heavy iron, thrown from the inside. The key still rested in the lock on the study side. Poirot removed it with a silk handkerchief, held it to the light, and saw the faintest of scratches near the wards, recent, bright, unmistakable. He pocketed the key and turned to the desk. The new will lay where death had interrupted its signing. Victor's name crossed out in a savage stroke of red ink. Eleanor's portion ringed with a question mark. A codicil leaving the bulk to charitable trusts at the discretion of my executor, D. Blackwell. A fountain pen lay uncapped beside it, the nib bent as though it had been hurled down in fury. A small brass paper knife had fallen to the floor. Poirot picked it up, sniffed the blade, and detected the faintest trace of almond. Bitter, unmistakable. Cyanide perhaps prepared and then abandoned for the surer steel. Only then did he ring for the household to assemble, in the long gallery. They came one by one, pale, red-eyed, wrapped in dressing gowns and suspicion. Poirot stood beneath a portrait of a bewigged Hargrove ancestor who looked as though he had died of indignation. The little detective's voice, when it came, was quiet yet carried to the furthest corner. "Mesdames et messieurs, we have what the English so charmingly call a locked-room mystery. Someone entered this room after midnight, stabbed Sir Reginald between the shoulder blades with considerable force, and departed, leaving the door bolted and the key inside. It is, of course, impossible. Therefore, we must discover how the impossible was achieved. To begin, I require the exact truth from each of you. Lies, even small ones, are the sand in the gears of justice." He began with Victor. The young man had dressed with careless haste, collar unfastened, tie askew, the smell of last night's brandy still on his breath. "I went to bed at 11:30, he said sullenly. "Read for a bit, some racing paper, and fell asleep. Heard the cry, came running, that's all." "And between midnight and 2:30? Victor shrugged. "Asleep. Ask the housemaid who passed my door with hot water bottles at 1. She'll tell you I was snoring." Clara, summoned next, flushed scarlet but confirmed it. "Captain Hargrove's door was ajar, sir. I saw him lying fully dressed on the bed, one arm over his face, snoring something dreadful." Eleanor followed. She had regained her composure and wore a severe black mourning dress that made her look older than her 25 years. "I read until 1, she said steadily. "Then I walked the corridor because I could not sleep. I passed father's door at perhaps 1:20. There was a light under it, and I heard voices, his and another, low, angry. I could not tell whose. Man or woman. A hesitation. A man, I think." Lady Amelia entered supported by Dr. Forbes. Her face was blotched with weeping, yet her voice held iron. "My husband came to my room shortly after midnight. We quarrelled. About the will, about everything. He said he intended to burn certain papers and left. I took a sleeping powder and heard nothing more until the scream. Blackwell was brisk, almost cheerful. I played patience in my room until 2. Heard the cry, came down, nothing to add." Dr. Forbes spoke last, gently apologetic. "Sir Reginald sent for me at 11:15. He complained of palpitations. I offered a sedative. He refused. I left him pacing this very room." Poirot listened, head tilted, eyes half closed. When the last voice faded, he opened them wide. "Bon! We have times, we have alibis of a sort, we have motives in abundance, money, hatred, fear. What we do not yet have is the method. That, my friends, is what Hercule Poirot will now pursue." He dismissed them with a small gesture, and, as they filed out, caught Clara Thorne by the elbow. "You, mademoiselle, you were devoted to your master once, n'est-ce pas? And lately, less so." Clara's eyes filled with sudden tears. "He changed, sir. After the war, he grew hard, but I never wished him harm. Yet someone did, and that someone was clever enough to make murder appear impossible." Poirot released her and stood alone in the gallery, hands clasped behind his back. Outside, the rain had ceased. A weak sun glimmered on wet leaves. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck 9. The investigation had begun. Chapter 4. The Weight of Small Things. Poirot spent the afternoon alone in the study, moving like a quiet black cat among the furniture of death. He measured distances with a silk tape, crouched to examine scuff marks only he could see, and at one point lay flat on the rug staring upward. At the ceiling rose as though it might confess, The constables outside the door grew used to the occasional soft exclamation in French. At 4 o'clock he rang for tea and requested that Inspector Hawkins join him. The inspector arrived wiping rain from his moustache and accepted a cup with gratitude. "Well, Mr. Poirot, any miracles yet?" "Miracles, no, but truths, yes, several small ones." Poirot set his cup down with precision. "Observe, the key shows fresh scratches. Someone has taken an impression of it, in soap perhaps or wax. Also, the bolt is stiff. It requires a strong pull to throw it home. Yet it was thrown after the murder from the outside. That interests me enormously." Hawkins grunted. "Duplicate key, then? Perhaps, or something more ingenious." Poirot opened his palm to reveal a length of fine fishing line, almost invisible, and a tiny steel crochet hook no longer than a match. "I found these caught behind the door jamb. Someone fished the key back through the keyhole after turning it from the outside, then drew the bolt across with the hook. Crude, but effective if one has steady nerves and a little practice." Hawkins whistled. "Clever devil. Clever, yes, and rehearsed. This was not a crime of sudden passion." Poirot led the inspector to the mantelpiece. The kris was kept here, in its sheath. Notice the gap in the dust. Someone removed it days ago, cleaned it, and replaced it loosely so that it might be snatched in a moment. Our murderer planned far ahead. They were interrupted by a knock. Clara entered, pale but composed, carrying a small silver tray. "Begging your pardon, sir. Lady Amelia asked me to bring these. They were found in the laundry basket this morning." On the tray lay a man's white dress shirt, heavily stained with blood at the cuffs and a single pearl earring. Lady Amelia's pearls. The house seemed to contract around that small discovery. Within the hour, Poirot had the entire household gathered again, this time in the winter parlour, where windows looked out on sodden yew trees. He placed the shirt and the earring on a table, as though they were crown jewels. "Someone attempted to hide these," he began mildly. "Someone failed. Let us see what they tell us." Victor stared at the shirt as though it might bite him. "That's not mine. Mine are monogrammed." "Yet it came from the gentleman's linen cupboard," Poirot said. "And the earring belongs to Lady Amelia. Curious, n'est-ce pas?" Lady Amelia touched her bare earlobes with trembling fingers. "I lost one yesterday. I thought it fell in the drawing-room." "Or was torn away in a struggle," Poirot suggested gently. Dr. Forbes cleared his throat. "If I may, the blood on the cuffs is already brown. It could be days old. Might it not be from Sir Reginald's nosebleeds? He suffered terribly." A plausible lie, but Poirot's smile was wintry. "We shall test it, of course, but let us add another curiosity." He produced a tiny scrap of lavender notepaper. This was under the desk. A fragment only, but the handwriting is a woman's. It reads, "Cannot bear any longer. Tonight it ends." Eleanor's hand flew to her throat. "That is my notepaper, but I wrote no such thing." "Someone wishes us to think you did," Poirot murmured. Blackwell shifted his bulk uncomfortably. "All very dramatic, but where does it get us? The door was locked from the inside. Unless this fishing line nonsense holds water, we're chasing ghosts." Poirot turned to him with sudden sharpness. "Monsieur Blackwell, you were seen by the second footman leaving your room at 20 minutes past 1. You told us you played patience until 2. Why the lie?" Blackwell's florid face darkened. "I went to the lavatory. Hardly a crime." Carrying a candle and walking toward the main staircase. The lavatory is in the opposite direction. A ripple passed through the room. Victor took a half-step toward Blackwell, fists clenched. "You were skulking about while my father was murdered." "Steady on," Blackwell growled. "I heard a noise, went to look, saw nothing, went back to bed." Poirot raised a hand for silence. "Enough. These are threads only. But threads, when woven tightly, become a rope. And someone in this room is already feeling it around the neck." He dismissed them, but as Clara passed, he caught her wrist. "You washed the shirt yourself, did you not? Before it was hidden?" She nodded, frightened. "Yes, sir. It came down in the ordinary laundry 2 days ago. I thought nothing of it until someone retrieved it, stained it again with fresh blood, and planted the earring. Thank you, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful." When she had gone, Poirot stood alone by the window, watching rooks wheel over the wet park. The net was spreading. Someone had begun to panic, to multiply clues instead of removing them. That was always the beginning of the end. Outside, dusk gathered early under a lid of cloud. Inside Blackthorn Manor the shadows lengthened, and every small object, a pearl earring, a torn note, a bloodied cuff, carried more weight than gold. Chapter 5. The Second Lie. Night fell hard, as though someone had dropped a black curtain over the downs. The electricity failed at 9:30. A tree down on the Lewis Road, the butler said, and Blackthorn Manor retreated into candlelight and suspicion. Poirot sat alone in the library with a single lamp. The fishing line coiled on the table before him like a pale worm. He was turning the tiny crochet hook between gloved fingers when the door opened without ceremony, and Eleanor Hargrove slipped inside. She had changed into a dark wool dress. Her face was white, her eyes enormous. "Monsieur Poirot," she whispered, "I must speak to you before I lose my nerve entirely." She closed the door and leaned against it. "I lied this morning. I did write that note, the one you found torn under the desk, but it was not a confession of murder. It was a love letter to someone in this house." Poirot regarded her steadily. "Continue, mademoiselle." She drew a shaking breath. "Desmond Blackwell. We have been lovers for almost a year. My father discovered it last week. That is why he rewrote the will, to punish me, to force me to end it. The note was meant for Desmond. I pushed it under the study door at 1:30. Father must have torn it up in rage." Poirot's eyebrows rose a fraction. "And Monsieur Blackwell, he confirms this tender arrangement. He dare not. He is married, and my father held notes of hand against him, thousands of pounds borrowed from the firm. If the affair came out, Desmond would be ruined twice over." A silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind rattling the tall windows. Poirot placed the crochet hook beside the fishing line. "You realize what this means, mademoiselle? You provide Monsieur Blackwell with a reason to silence your father forever." Eleanor's chin lifted. "Desmond is no killer. He was with me from 1:20 until nearly 2, in the old music room. That is the truth, Monsieur Poirot. Swear it on my mother's life." She left as suddenly as she had come. Poirot remained motionless for a long minute, then murmured, "One more thread, and the knot tightens." At 11 o'clock the house should have been asleep, but doors kept opening and closing like nervous eyelids. Victor Hargrove was discovered by the constable prowling the west corridor with a revolver in his pocket. "Couldn't sleep, old man. Thought I heard prowlers." Lady Amelia swallowed 2 extra powders and was found by Clara wandering the gallery in her nightgown, murmuring her husband's name as though he might still answer. Dr. Forbes was seen carrying a small black bag toward the servants' wing and back again. He claimed he had been treating the cook for nerves. Poirot summoned Inspector Hawkins to the billiard room and spoke softly behind a locked door. When they emerged, Hawkins's face was grim. The inspector posted an extra man at the head of the main staircase and another beneath the study window. No one was to move about the house without escort. At 20 minutes past midnight, the second shock came. Clara Thorne's scream echoed from the first-floor corridor, high, piercing, cut off as abruptly as Sir Reginald's had been. Feet thundered, candles flared. They found Clara on her knees outside Lady Amelia's bedroom, a silver salver overturned at her feet, coffee pooling across the carpet. In the puddle floated a small crystal phial, uncorked, smelling faintly of bitter almonds. "Her ladyship's nighttime drink," Clara gasped. "I brought it myself from the pantry. I tasted it to be sure it was sweet. Habit, sir. And my tongue went numb at once. Poison, sir. Cyanide, like the paper knife." Lady Amelia stood in her doorway, deathly pale but unharmed. I dismissed Clara before she poured. I could not drink tonight. Poirot knelt, sniffed the phial, touched a drop to the tip of a gloved finger, and nodded. "Enough hydrocyanic acid to kill 6 people. Someone grows impatient." The house, already trembling, now shook with open fear. Victor demanded that everyone be searched. Blackwell protested loudly that this was hysteria. Dr. Forbes quietly pointed out that the pantry had been locked. Only 3 people possessed keys: the butler, the cook, and Clara herself. Clara began to weep. I swear on my mother's grave." Poirot raised a hand for silence. "No one will accuse hastily. But from this moment, mes amis, we are in the second act of our little drama. The murderer has struck again and missed. That is a dangerous creature, cornered, desperate, and still among us." He ordered every bedroom searched. Nothing was found except, in the pocket of Dr. Forbes's second-best overcoat, a duplicate key to the study door, wrapped in cotton wool. The doctor stared at it as though it were a scorpion. "I have never seen it before in my life." Hawkins locked the key in his notebook and looked at Poirot. The little Belgian's eyes were bright as winter stars. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "the mask begins to slip. Tonight, Inspector, no one sleeps alone." The candles were snuffed one by one. Blackthorn Manor sank into darkness, but it was the darkness of a held breath, waiting for the next lie to break the silence. Chapter 6. The unravelling morning arrived thin and grey, the colour of cigarette ash. Blackthorn Manor looked as though it had not slept at all. Curtains still half-drawn, fires unlit, every face stamped with the same question none dared ask aloud. Poirot took no breakfast. Instead, he walked the corridors alone, hands clasped behind his back, humming a little air from Offenbach. He paused outside each bedroom door, listening, noting which floorboard creaked under the carpet, which key turned too smoothly in its lock. At 9:20, he summoned them all to the drawing-room and closed the double doors with a soft, final click. They sat in a rough half-circle, candle-smudged and hollow-eyed, Lady Amelia upright as a marble widow, Victor nursing a brandy though the clocks had not yet struck 10, Eleanor twisting a handkerchief to shreds, Blackwell glowering by the window, Dr. Forbes polishing and repolishing his spectacles, Clara standing behind her mistress like a small brown shadow. Inspector Hawkins stood at Poirot's elbow, notebook open, face carefully blank. Poirot did not begin dramatically. He simply placed 5 objects on the occasional table as though dealing cards. The length of fishing line, the tiny crochet hook, the duplicate key wrapped in cotton wool, the torn fragment of lavender notepaper, and the empty cyanide phial. "These," he said pleasantly, "are the lies made solid. They have told me everything." He let the silence ripen. Then, very gently, he turned to Dr. Julian Forbes. "Monsieur le Docteur, you have been most unfortunate. First your coat pocket yields a key you claim never to have seen. Then the blood on the shirt cuff, when tested by the police surgeon this morning, proves to be your own rare group. AB negative, shared, only by yourself and the late Sir Reginald. Finally, the cyanide in Lady Amelia's cup matches exactly the preparation missing from your dispensary. It is too much misfortune for one man, n'est-ce pas? Forbes went the colour of old parchment. His lips moved soundlessly. Poirot continued, almost kindly. You have been Sir Reginald's physician for 15 years. You have also, for 8 of those years, been quietly borrowing from his private account to cover losses on the stock market, losses he discovered last month. He threatened exposure, ruin, prison. Worse, he intended to name you executor of the new will, knowing you would never dare touch a penny once he was dead. You were trapped. Forbes found his voice at last, thin and cracked. I am a doctor, not a murderer. Yet doctors know precisely where to place a blade between the vertebrae for instant death, and doctors keep hydrocyanic acid in their bags. Poirot picked up the fishing line. On Tuesday last you took an impression of the study key, while Sir Reginald dozed in his chair after luncheon. You had the duplicate cut in Brighton on Wednesday. The scratches on the original are unmistakable. You removed the Christie days earlier, cleaned it, and waited. Last night, when the house was restless after the quarrel about the will, you slipped downstairs at 1:15. Sir Reginald admitted you. He still trusted his old friend. You talked. You persuaded him to pour 2 glasses of brandy. While his back was turned, you drove the Chris home. Then, with the coolness of the operating theatre, you locked the door from the inside, passed the key back through the keyhole on the fishing line, drew the bolt with the crochet hook, a trick you learned as a medical student for opening locked dispensary cabinets, and walked away. A perfect locked room. Forbes stared at the carpet. The bloodied shirt? Victor demanded hoarsely. Dr. Forbes cut his hand weeks ago, glass in the dispensary. He kept the shirt, soaked the cuffs afresh with Sir Reginald's blood after the murder, and planted Lady Amelia's earring, taken from her dressing table while she slept off her powders, to suggest a woman's crime of passion. The torn love note was another flourish, meant to point to Mademoiselle Eleanor. Finally, when panic set in, he attempted to silence the one person whose inheritance no longer mattered, Lady Amelia. Lady Amelia made a small choked sound. Forbes lifted his head. His eyes were suddenly ancient. He destroyed me, he whispered. Everything I had worked for, 40 years of study, of service. He laughed when he told me, laughed. He rose slowly, as though his bones pained him, and extended both wrists toward Hawkins. I am ready, Inspector. Hawkins snapped on the handcuffs with the quiet efficiency of a man who has done it too many times. As Forbes was led away, Poirot spoke once more, almost to himself. The desperate culprit is always the most dangerous because he believes he has nothing left to lose. Dr. Forbes discovered too late that one thing remains, the truth, and the truth, mes amis, is a singularly persistent creature. The doors closed behind the doctor and the inspector. In the drawing-room, the fire settled with a small, apologetic sound, and the long ordeal of Blackthorn Manor was over. Chapter 7. After the Storm. The silence that followed the closing of the doors was not relief. It was the hollow hush that comes after a long fever has broken. The patient breathes, but no one dares believe the danger has truly passed. Lady Amelia sat very straight on the edge of her chair, hands folded in her lap, as though she were still receiving callers. Only the tremor in her lower lip betrayed her. Victor moved first, crossing to the sideboard with the mechanical gait of a man walking in his sleep. He poured 3 fingers of whiskey, stared at it, then tipped it into the fire. The flames hissed and flared blue. Eleanor began to cry, not dramatically, but with the quiet, unstoppable tears of someone who has simply run out of strength. Clara, unnoticed until now, went to her, knelt and rested her head against the girl's knee like a faithful dog. Poirot remained standing by the mantel, small and neat and oddly remote, watching them all with the compassion of a man who has seen too many families bleed. At length, Lady Amelia spoke, her voice thin but steady. "Julian Forbes was in this house for half my married life. He brought my children into the world. He sat with me when Victor had scarlet fever, when Eleanor broke her arm falling from the apple tree, and all the while he was stealing and planning she could not finish. The sentence hung in the air like a torn curtain." Victor turned from the hearth, eyes red. "I hated father," he said flatly. "I hated him for years. I wished him dead 100 times, but I never wanted it to be Julian, anyone but Julian." Blackwell cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the quiet room. "Well, the police will need statements. The new will, is invalid now, I suppose. Back to the old one." He attempted a brisk smile. It died against the cold faces around him. "I'll telephone the solicitors." He left quickly, as though the room had become contagious. Poirot spoke at last, gently. "Madam, you will wish to know certain things. Dr. Forbes left a letter in Inspector Hawkins's keeping. He asks your forgiveness and that of Mademoiselle Eleanor. He says the thefts began as small loans after the market crash of 22, and that Sir Reginald's discovery turned mercy to malice. He could not face disgrace at 60. Lady Amelia closed her eyes. "Reginald could be cruel when he felt betrayed," she whispered. "I knew that better than anyone." Clara rose, wiping her own eyes. "Shall I open the curtains, my lady? The rain has stopped." "Yes, Clara. Let the light in." The heavy brocade swished back, and pale, November sunshine spilled across the carpet, revealing dust motes dancing like tiny ghosts. Victor poured another whiskey, this time drank it. "What happens now?" he asked no one in particular. Poirot answered, "Now you begin the long, untidy business of living. Debts will be paid honourably, I think, Captain Hargrove. Engagements will be reconsidered. Secrets will lose their poison in daylight, and Blackthorn Manor will either heal or be sold. That is for you to decide." Eleanor lifted her head. "I shall break my engagement," she said with sudden firmness. "I was marrying to escape father. There is nothing left to escape." Lady Amelia reached for her daughter's hand. For the first time in years, their fingers twined without tension. Outside, gravel crunched as the police car carrying Dr. Forbes disappeared between the dripping yews. The sound faded, and the house settled into itself with a long, weary sigh. Poirot picked up his gloves and cane. "My carriage is ordered for the 11:30 train. Inspector Hawkins has all he requires." Victor stepped forward, impulsively. "Monsieur Poirot, thank you. I don't know what else to say." Poirot inclined his head. "Say nothing, mon capitaine. Only remember this. A desperate man is a man who believes he has no choices. Give yourself choices, always." He moved toward the door, then paused beside Clara. "And you, mademoiselle, you have been brave and loyal. A new position awaits you with Mademoiselle Eleanor, I think, when she sets up her own establishment. 15 years is long enough to serve one family's ghosts." Clara's eyes filled again, but she managed a curtsy. In the hall the butler waited, expressionless, holding Poirot's overcoat and hat. The great front doors stood open. Beyond them the park lay washed clean, every leaf glittering. Poirot stepped out onto the portico and breathed deeply. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke and the faint, sweet rot of autumn. He permitted himself one small, satisfied sigh. Behind him, Blackthorn Manor stood silent. No longer a fortress of secrets, merely an old house with too many rooms and too many memories. The Bentley purred up the drive. Poirot climbed in, settled his hat precisely on his knee, and glanced back once as the car swung round the fountain. Lady Amelia, Eleanor, Victor, and Clara stood framed in the doorway, 4 small figures in the vast stone arch, holding one another up. Poirot raised a gloved hand in farewell. The car gathered speed, tyres hissing on wet gravel, and Blackthorn Manor dwindled in the mirror until it was no larger than a child's toy. Poirot leaned back against the leather, closed his eyes, and allowed the rhythm of the engine to lull him. Another case concluded. Another family left to mend the cracks he had been forced to open. The little grey cells were at rest, for the moment. Chapter 8. The Quiet Reckoning. The train to Victoria was almost empty. A single first-class carriage lit by weak November sun that slanted through the windows and laid pale bars across the empty seats opposite Poirot. He sat very still, gloved hands resting on the silver head of his cane, watching Sussex slide past in watercolour streaks of brown and gold. Yet his mind was not on the landscape. It was still in the drawing-room at Blackthorn, moving among the faces that had watched Dr. Forbes taken away. He had left too soon, perhaps. Justice had been served, but justice is a cold companion. What remained was the slow, private work of grief and rearrangement. And Hercule Poirot had never been able to walk entirely away from that. At Victoria, he took a taxicab not to his flat in Whitehall Court, but to the quiet mews behind Harley Street where Dr. Julian Forbes had kept rooms above his consulting practice for 30 years. The police had already searched. The seals were broken, the desk drawers yawning open, papers scattered like dead leaves. Poirot moved through the rooms with the reverence of a priest in a ruined church. He found what he expected on the blotter, a letter addressed in Forbes's careful, old-fashioned hand. My dear Poirot, by the time you read this, I shall be in a cell, and the scandal sheets will have begun their feast. You were mercifully brief in the drawing-room. The whole truth would have destroyed what little the Hargroves have left. Permit me, therefore, to finish the confession you began. The thefts were worse than you said. I took not thousands, but tens of thousands, always intending to repay when the market turned. It never turned. Reginald discovered the last defalcation the day he invited you to Blackthorn. He told me that evening, after dinner, while the others were at coffee. He was almost gentle. He said he would not prosecute if I resigned quietly and left England within the month. I was to be allowed my freedom, but not my name, not my profession, not the right ever to practice medicine again. At 60, after a lifetime of service, I was to be erased. I went to the study at 1:15 to beg. He laughed, actually laughed, and turned to pour himself a nightcap. The kriss was in my pocket. I had carried it for days like a talisman of despair. When he turned his back, the thing seemed to leap into my hand. One thrust, and 40 years ended in a heartbeat. I did not plan the locked room at first. That came in the minutes after, while the blood was still warm on my cuffs. Panic is a strange midwife to ingenuity. The attempt on Amelia was cowardice, pure and simple. I thought if another death followed quickly, suspicion would scatter like chaff. I am ashamed of that most of all. Tell Amelia, if you will, that the pearls were always hers by right. Reginald bought them with money he took from her marriage settlement. Tell Eleanor she is stronger than any of us knew. Tell Victor that his father loved him in the only way he understood, by trying to forge him into a harder metal. And tell Clara Thorne that the £500 in my desk drawer is hers, for faithful service above and beyond any wage. You will find my war medals in the top left drawer. Burn them with this letter. Yours, in defeat and gratitude, Julian Forbes Poirot folded the pages with care, slipped them into his breast pocket, and stood for a long time at the window overlooking the bare plane trees. Then he opened the drawer, removed the small leather box containing the medals, and dropped them one by one into the empty grate. A twist of paper, a match, and the ribbons curled black before the crosses themselves glowed red and sank into ash. He left the building without looking back. 2 weeks later, on a morning sharp with the promise of frost, Poirot received a parcel at his flat. Inside was a small jeweller's box and a single sheet of black-edged notepaper. Monsieur Poirot, the enclosed belonged to my mother. She wished you to have it with her deepest thanks. She asks me to say that Blackthorn is to be sold in the spring. Victor has taken a commission in Kenya. He sails next month. Clara accompanies me to the London house, where I intend to finish the studies Father forbade. We are none of us the people we were, but we are, perhaps, the people we were meant to become. With sincere regard, Eleanor Hargrove Poirot opened the box. On a bed of black velvet lay a single pearl earring, perfectly matched to the triple string he remembered gleaming at Lady Amelia's throat. He carried it to the window. In the cold light, the pearl seemed to hold an entire universe of soft fire. Poirot turned it once between finger and thumb, then placed it carefully in the small morocco case where he kept objects that refused to be forgotten. A fragment of aeroplane propeller, a bullet-flattened coin, a child's tiny shoe once recovered from a ruin in Belgium. Outside, London traffic rumbled like a distant sea. Poirot closed the case, set it back on the shelf among the neat ranks of books, and allowed himself the very smallest of smiles. Another story finished. Another set of lives quietly rearranged by the ripple of one man's despair. He adjusted the crease in his trousers, consulted his pocket watch, and reached for his hat. Somewhere in the city, a new invitation would be waiting, a new storm gathering behind polite handwriting on heavy cream paper. Hercule Poirot was ready. Chapter 9. The Final Order. A month after Dr. Forbes was sentenced at Lewes Assizes, 15 years, the judge said, taking into account his age and prior good character, Hercule Poirot returned to Blackthorn Manor one last time. The house had already begun to die. Dust sheets covered the furniture like shrouds. The great chandelier in the hall was swathed in muslin, and every footstep echoed twice. The sale was scheduled for February. The auctioneer's men had measured and tagged and departed, leaving only the smell of their cigars and the faint rectangles on the walls where portraits had hung. Poirot had come at Lady Amelia's request. She met him in the winter parlour, thinner now, dressed in dove-grey cashmere that made her look almost translucent. Clara hovered behind her with a tray, tea things that rattled betrayingly. "Thank you for coming, Monsieur Poirot." Lady Amelia's voice was steady, but the pearls were gone from her throat. Only a narrow black ribbon remained. I could not let the house go without knowing everything, every last corner of the truth. Julian's confession was incomplete. There are things only you can settle. Poirot bowed over her hand. "Ask Madame. The little grey cells are still at your service." She led him through the silent corridors to the study. The door had been repaired, the broken lock replaced. Inside, the room had been stripped. No desk, no rug, no Malay kris above the mantel. Only the tall windows looking onto bare rose beds and the faint darker patch on the floorboards where blood had once soaked through. Lady Amelia closed the door. Julian said he acted alone, she began, yet certain details still trouble me. The fishing line, the crochet hook, those were clever, but not clever enough for a man who had never attempted such a thing before. And the duplicate key. He swore he had it cut in Brighton on the Wednesday, but the police could find no jeweller who remembered him. I think someone helped him. I think someone in this house gave him the idea, perhaps even the tools. Poirot regarded her with quiet admiration. You have always been perceptive, madame. Yes, there was an accomplice, not in the murder itself, but in the method. A person who wished Sir Reginald dead, but lacked the courage to strike the blow. He walked to the window and stood with his back to the light. Consider the sequence. On the Tuesday evening, while Sir Reginald dozed after dinner, Dr. Forbes took the wax impression of the key. He did not yet know what to do with it. That night he spoke, in confidence he believed, to the one person who had always listened to his financial worries, Clara Thorne. Clara, who had followed them silently, made a small sound but did not move. Poirot continued. Mademoiselle Clara had once been Sir Reginald's mistress. A brief, regretted affair 20 years ago ended when he tired of her. She had remained in the house out of loyalty, pride, and the lack of anywhere else to go. She hated him quietly, faithfully, every day. When Dr. Forbes confessed his terror, she saw a way to be rid of her old tormentor without soiling her own hands. She had, as a girl, worked in a locksmith's shop in Brighton before entering service. She knew exactly how to turn a wax impression into a working key. She also knew the fishing line trick. Her father had been a poacher on the Ouse. She supplied the line, the tiny crochet hook from her work basket, and calm instructions. She even suggested wiping the kris and returning it to its place to confuse the timing. Lady Amelia turned slowly to the maid. Clara! Clara's face was stone. I never told him to kill Sir Reginald. I only told him how to make it look impossible if he ever had to. I thought it would stay talk, desperate men's talk. When he came to my room that night, after it was done, he was shaking so hard he could not speak. He made me promise silence. I promised. Poirot's voice softened. You kept your promise, mademoiselle, even when suspicion fell on you, the bloodied shirt, the cyanide. You were prepared to hang rather than betray him. That is devotion of a sort. Lady Amelia walked to the empty fireplace and rested one hand on the cold mantel. What happens now? She asked. Nothing, Poirot said simply. Dr. Forbes is convicted. The Crown has its murderer. To drag a housemaid into the dock for lending a piece of fishing line would serve no one and reopen wounds already scarring. Mademoiselle Clara will leave service. I have arranged a position for her as companion to an elderly lady in Torquay, far from Sussex, far from memories. She will take a new name and a small pension from the estate. The truth dies here, in this room, with the three of us. Clara began to weep then, not loudly, but with the slow, exhausted tears of a lifetime's bitterness finally spent. Lady Amelia crossed to her, and to Poirot's quiet astonishment, placed both arms around the smaller woman. "You poor foolish creature," she murmured. "You could have left years ago. He was not worth your hate." They stood like that for a long minute, mistress and maid, bound now by something stronger than years of obedience. Poirot watched them with the faintest shine in his own eyes. Then he took from his pocket a small object wrapped in silk, the single pearl earring Eleanor had sent him. "For you, madame," he said, placing it in Lady Amelia's palm. "Your string is complete again. Wear it when you feel strong enough. And when you do not, remember that even the hardest stone can be cracked by a tear held back too long." Lady Amelia closed her fingers over the pearl. Outside, the winter sun broke briefly through the clouds and laid a blade of light across the bare floorboards, exactly where Sir Reginald had fallen. Poirot turned to leave. At the door he paused. One last thing. The house will sell quickly. There are buyers who care nothing for ghosts. When it does, plant a white rose over that patch of floor. Roses remember nothing, and they forgive everything. He walked out into the corridor, where the dust sheets fluttered like surrender flags. Behind him, the two women remained in the empty room, holding each other in the thin, clear light, while Blackthorn Manor, for the first time in a century, began to let go of its dead. Chapter 10. The Last Train Home. The sale of Blackthorn Manor took place on a raw February morning in 1926. A thin snow was falling, the kind that melts the instant it touches anything warm. And the auctioneer's voice carried clearly across the gravel to where Poirot stood beneath the portico for the final time. He had not intended to come. Curiosity, that oldest of his vices, had simply proved stronger than resolve. The house sold for less than expected. City money wanted new brick and electric light. Old stone and old sins were out of fashion. A brewer from Manchester bought it, planning to turn the West Wing into a country hotel. Poirot watched the hammer fall and felt nothing so dramatic as sorrow, only the small, precise ache of a chapter closing. Lady Amelia had already gone. She spent Christmas in Italy with a cousin, and wrote from Sorrento that the sea was kinder than any human face she had lately known. Victor sailed for Mombasa in January. His last letter, forwarded by Eleanor, was surprisingly cheerful, and spoke of coffee planting and learning Swahili. Eleanor herself had taken a flat in Bloomsbury and was reading medicine at the London School of Medicine for Women. She signed her letters E.M. Hargrove, student, with a flourish that made Poirot smile. Clara Thorne, now Mrs. Clara Wren, companion to a deaf admiral's widow in Torquay, sent a postcard at New Year. A coloured photograph of orange trees against a china blue sea. And, on the reverse, 3 words only: the roses bloom. Poirot kept the card on his mantel beside the Morocco case that held the single pearl. On the afternoon of the sale, he walked once more through the empty rooms. The dust sheets had been stripped, the floors were bare, echoing. In the study, the darker patch on the boards had been planned away, but when Poirot laid his gloved hand flat, he fancied he could still feel the faintest warmth, as though the house remembered. He left by the garden door and followed the gravel path that skirted the rose beds. Someone, the under-gardener perhaps kept on until the new owner arrived, had planted a single white bush exactly where the study window looked out. It was no more than a whip now, leafless and forlorn, but a small cardboard label tied to the stem read, Madame Alfred Carrière, 1926. Poirot touched one thorny stem with reverence, then turned away. The Bentley was waiting beyond the gates. As it pulled smoothly onto the Lewis Road, snow thickened and began to lie. Poirot watched the manor shrink in the rear window until the falling flakes swallowed it whole. Back in London that evening, he dined alone at his usual table in a small Soho restaurant, where the patronne still served him crêpe. Suzette flamed with the same theatrical flourish she had used before the war. Afterwards he walked home through streets muffled white, the snow erasing footprints almost before they were made. In his flat the fire was laid, and the lamps glowed amber. George, his valet, had left a small parcel on the desk wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. A note in Eleanor's handwriting lay beside it. For your collection, E. Inside was a brass carriage key, heavy and old, its bow, stamped with the blackthorn crest. The duplicate, Poirot realized, the one Clara had cut, the one Forbes had used, the one the police never found. Eleanor must have taken it from the study drawer before the seals were fixed. Poirot turned the key over in his palm, feeling its cold weight. Then he opened the morocco case, laid the key beside the pearl earring, and closed the lid with a soft click. He poured a tisane, settled into his armchair, and allowed the silence to gather. Outside, London snow muffled even the sound of taxis. Inside, the fire settled into quiet ruby coals. Somewhere in the city, a telephone would ring tomorrow, or a letter arrive in a distraught hand, and the little grey cells would be summoned once more. But tonight belonged to Blackthorn. Poirot raised his cup in a small, private toast. "To desperate culprits," he murmured, "and to those who loved them enough to help them sin. To houses that remember, and to roses that forget. And to the dead, may they finally be quiet." He drank, set the cup aside, and for the first time in many weeks, allowed himself to sleep without first arranging every object on the nightstand in perfect symmetry. In Torquay, a white rose waited for spring. In Kenya, coffee seedlings pushed through red earth. In Bloomsbury, a young woman bent over books that smelled of carbolic and hope. And in a quiet flat above the Thames, Hercule Poirot dreamed, not of murder, but of a garden where snow had melted and something green and stubborn was beginning to grow. The case was closed. The story, at last, was finished.